She walked into the airport alone. No title, no entourage, just a plane ticket and a storm of silence. They saw her skin before they saw her seat. They questioned her presence, doubted her name, erased her without a word. But what they didn't know is that she held the power to rewrite their entire future with a single signature. This wasn't just a flight, it was a reckoning. And the woman they ignored, she was the one thing they never saw coming. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story, it is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. At 6:04 a.m., Simone Carter stepped into Kennedy International Airport alone. No entourage, no assistant trailing her with coffee or luggage. Just a woman in a soft beige trench coat pushing a navy blue carry-on that rolled quietly behind her. Her sneakers made almost no sound as she passed through the sleek terminal. Her face calm, her expression unreadable, but her presence pulled invisible threads through the air. People didn't stare, not quite, but they noticed. The way you notice something that doesn't quite fit, even if you can't explain why. No one knew she had once been called the savior of American aviation. No one knew she sat on more corporate boards than half the Fortune 100 combined. No one knew she held final approval over a $4 billion investment package that would decide the fate of one of the country's largest airlines. She had built entire companies from the ground up and buried those that refused to evolve. But this morning, none of that power followed her through the terminal doors. This wasn't a business trip. Not in the traditional sense. It was a trial, a personal one, a final test. She moved with intention toward the first-class priority check-in lane. She'd booked her ticket under a different variation of her name, S. L. Carter, with no executive title, no red flags. She wore no luxury watch, no makeup, and carried nothing but a small tote bag and a folded envelope sealed with wax. She didn't look like someone worth stopping, but that was exactly the point. The first eyes she felt weren't the security guards or the airline staff, they were the passengers. A man in a $3,000 suit eyed her as if she'd wandered into the wrong corridor. A woman in high heels and red lipstick gave her a once-over and then turned to whisper something to her partner. Simone didn't react. She knew that silence could speak louder than confrontation, and today, silence would be her weapon. At the head of the line stood a young attendant with a perfectly slicked back ponytail and a face trained to smile without sincerity. Her name tag read, Angela. She greeted the passenger in front of Simone with a chirpy "Welcome aboard, sir. Thank you for flying with us." Then her eyes met Simone's. The shift was microscopic, half a blink, maybe a breath, but it was there. The moment when someone sees your skin before your boarding pass. Angela's smile faltered just barely, but her tone cooled. "Are you sure you're in the right line?" she asked, voice sweet but tightly wound. Simone gave a quiet nod. First class, Zone 1. Angela's eyes scanned the ticket. Everything was correct. No red flags. Still, she hesitated. "Please step aside for a brief screening," she said flatly. Random procedure. Simone stepped aside, wordless. She didn't ask why. She didn't protest. She just waited as two security staff approached from behind a small glass booth. One male, one female. Their uniforms crisp, their faces unreadable. "Ma'am, please follow us," the male officer said. Simone turned without speaking and followed them past the velvet ropes and into a narrow hallway labeled Security Review, Authorized Personnel Only. She was calm, collected, but inside her mind, she was counting seconds, glances, silence. Every detail mattered now. This wasn't just a check. This was the moment the system exposed itself. The room they led her to was sterile. White walls, fluorescent lights, a single metal chair at a small table. The questions came quickly. Name Simone Carter. Destination Seattle. Purpose of travel internal business review. The female officer glanced at the tote bag and gestured. "May we search it?" Simone nodded. They opened the bag and found only a slim laptop, a bound journal, and the sealed envelope. The woman reached for the envelope. "What's this, confidential documents?" Simone replied. "Company property. If you need to access them, I'll need to contact legal." The male officer paused, then leaned back. "You said internal review. What kind of work do you do?" Simone looked him in the eye. Her voice was calm but clear. "I evaluate risk." That was all she said. The officers exchanged a glance. Then, without another word, they left the room. Simone sat still, eyes forward, hands folded in her lap. Outside the room, behind the glass wall in the operations center, someone was watching. Not a supervisor, an observer. A young black woman wearing a headset seated at the end of the surveillance station. Her eyes scanned the feed lingering on Simone's face. For a second, she looked uncertain. Then something in her expression shifted. Recognition, respect. Maybe it was both. After 17 minutes, the door opened. "You're free to go," the officer said. "No issues found." Simone rose. Of course there weren't. She didn't look back as she walked down the hallway, but she knew now what she needed to know. This wasn't about a single insult, a single mistake. It was about how quietly injustice moved, how it hid behind protocols, behind smiles, behind assumptions. Back in the terminal, the boarding gate buzzed with activity. Angela was helping a couple in matching tennis jackets. When she saw Simone approach again, her eyes widened just slightly. She said nothing. Simone handed her the ticket. The scanner beeped green. "You may board." Angela said voice, quieter now. Simone took her time walking down the jet bridge. Every step was deliberate, not angry, not vengeful, just clear. She found her seat, 1A, window. She placed her tote in the overhead, took out her envelope, and sat down. Across the aisle, a white man in his 50s leaned over, eyeing her without subtlety. "Didn't think they let folks like you up here," he said, with a chuckle like he was telling a joke no one else had the guts to say. Simone turned her head slowly. Her smile was gentle, her voice soft. "You'd be surprised what people like me are allowed to do." Then she looked out the window. The sky outside was streaked with morning light, golden and vast. The plane hadn't moved yet, but Simone knew this flight was going to change more than just her location. It would change the conversation. And the storm hadn't even begun. The hum of the aircraft engines grew louder as the cabin filled, seat by seat, with well-dressed travelers clicking their seatbelts and settling into the leather comfort of first class. Simone Carter sat silently in seat 1A, her hands resting on her lap, her gaze fixed out the window. From the outside, she was simply another passenger. Inside, she was a watchtower. This was no longer a journey. It was an observation. A flight attendant walked briskly through the cabin, her name tag catching the light C. Daniels. She stopped at row 1 tray of hot towels in hand and looked at Simone without really seeing her. There was no nod, no smile, no acknowledgement. She skipped past offering towels to the man beside Simone instead. He accepted it with a faint smirk, then glanced sideways at Simone. "Guess they ran out," he said like he expected her to laugh. She didn't. He turned away, uncomfortable, in a silence he'd invited but couldn't handle. Daniels returned with a glass of champagne for each seat, except 1A. Again, no explanation, no eye contact. Just invisibility dressed as routine. Simone took a breath. This wasn't the first time she'd been overlooked, misread, or passed over. But today, the air felt thicker, more intentional. Not rage, not even malice. Just a quiet, practiced erasure. It didn't have a voice, but it echoed in every unacknowledged gesture. In the row behind her, a middle-aged woman leaned toward a man in designer glasses. "It's different these days," she whispered. "You just never know who you'll end up next to." He chuckled softly. First class used to mean something. Neither of them noticed that Simone had heard every word. The plane taxied slowly toward the runway. Simone closed her eyes, briefly, replaying the last 90 minutes in her mind, the security room, the subtle hesitation, the guarded tones of people who didn't see her as a threat, only as an anomaly. The problem wasn't the system, it was the people inside it who believed their gaze was neutral, that they could tell who mattered just by looking. That's what made this moment matter. She remembered something her grandmother once said while stirring a pot of collard greens in a sunlit kitchen in Atlanta. The worst blindness is when someone's eyes are open, but they still don't see you. As the wheels lifted off the ground, Simone opened her eyes again. The city beneath faded. Her thoughts didn't. She had grown up understanding that presence didn't always equal power. And now she sat in one of the most expensive seats on this flight, holding more authority than anyone else on board. And yet to those around her, she was still nobody. But that was about to change. 2 rows back, a flight attendant named Marcus adjusted his tie and glanced forward. His eyes briefly landed on Simone. He didn't recognize her, but something in her composure struck him. She wasn't scrolling. Her phone wasn't sipping champagne, wasn't buried in a travel pillow. She was alert, still, watching. He noticed that C. Daniels hadn't served her. No towel, no drink, no smile. He hesitated, then leaned toward his colleague. "Did you skip 1A?" he asked under his breath. Daniels shrugged. She didn't ask for anything. Marcus paused. She didn't have to. Daniels rolled her eyes and walked toward the back galley. Marcus took a breath, grabbed a fresh towel and a glass of sparkling water with lemon and walked up the aisle. "Good morning," he said quietly. "I just realized you didn't receive service during takeoff. My apologies." Simone looked at him, really looked. His tone wasn't rehearsed. His eyes didn't dart. He saw her. "Thank you," she said simply. He placed the items gently on her tray table, then added, "If there's anything you need during the flight, don't hesitate." Simone nodded once. She didn't need anything, but the gesture mattered. Not because it corrected what had been missed, but because it proved it had been noticed. Moments later, the intercom chimed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached cruising altitude. Feel free to move about the cabin." As people shifted in their seats and adjusted their recliners, Simone reached for her tote bag. From it, she pulled out a sleek tablet and a slim folder, the kind used in boardrooms, not business lounges. The screen lit up with biometric scan, revealing confidential investment reports, airline performance metrics, and a live document marked risk assessment. Final phase Grand Crest Airlines. This wasn't just a flight. This was the last field test of a company about to receive a $4 billion funding round, a round that Simone had the authority to approve or reject. And right now, the data wasn't looking good. She noted the incident report already logged into the system: passenger S.L. Carter, detained at gate without cause, subject to secondary screening. No violations found. Boarding delayed by 22 minutes. No apology issued. Her finger hovered above the escalate button. But she didn't press it. Not yet. Because the true weight of injustice doesn't lie in the grand gestures, it lies in the quiet moments when no one thinks they're being watched. A few minutes later, a flight crew member wheeled by with a snack cart. Daniels passed Simone again, without pause. Marcus saw it. So did the young black woman sitting in economy near the divider curtain, watching from behind her paperback novel. Her name was Ayanna, a junior consultant on her way to a diversity leadership summit in Seattle. She recognized Simone. Not because she'd seen her name, but because years ago, she'd watched a panel online about women in venture capital. A panel where Simone spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet authority that made you feel like change was actually possible. And now, Ayanna watched that same woman be treated like a seat filler. She reached into her bag, pulled out a notebook, and began to write notes she would later share at that summit. About how change wasn't just corporate. It was deeply, painfully human. By the time the plane began its descent, Simone had made her decision. She closed the folder, tapped a few lines into her secure tablet, and initiated the audit completion protocol. A signal encrypted itself in real time and sent to the Advivest Group's executive servers. No drama, no announcement, no retribution. Just a quiet decision to see the truth for what it was and do something about it. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do isn't speak, it's remember and act. The room had no windows, no clocks, and no sense of time. The lighting was too white, the chairs too stiff, and the silence too calculated. They called it a customer resolution space, but it was really just a holding room for discomfort, a space that wasn't designed for reconciliation, only containment. Simone Carter sat across from three figures in navy uniforms, each of them holding clipboards as if they were shields. She didn't fidget. She didn't complain. She simply waited, not with patience, but with precision. The woman seated directly across from her wore a name badge that read Operations Integrity, G. Alvarez. Her posture was trained, but her eyes flickered with unease every time Simone met her gaze. Beside her, a man with salt and pepper hair introduced himself as Chief Compliance Officer Benton Hayes. The third, a security lead named Malcolm Shaw, said nothing, just clicked his pen every 30 seconds like a metronome for the interrogation. Ms. Carter Hayes began his voice, overly measured. We appreciate your cooperation. There seems to have been some confusion at the boarding gate and during the flight. We just want to ensure we understand the nature of the incident. Simone tilted her head slightly. Confusion, she repeated. Hayes shifted in his chair. Yes. From the reports, it seems there may have been some procedural missteps. Simone nodded slowly, letting the silence press down between them. You detained me. You questioned me in a private room. Then you allowed a flight attendant to publicly question my seat assignment and failed to intervene, all after I scanned a first-class boarding pass with elite clearance. Alvarez jumped in. We want to make it clear this wasn't personal. That's the problem, Simone said. Her voice was soft, but it cut clean. When something like this happens to someone like me, it's never personal. It's protocol. It's comfort. It's what's been normalized so deeply, no one even sees it anymore. Malcolm's pen finally stopped clicking. She reached into her bag and laid a document on the table. I want you to read this. They hesitated, so she continued. It's the ethics review report drafted by my team. The incident on this flight was part of a Level 4 behavioral stress test. Grand Crest Airlines was under confidential evaluation for federal funding alignment. Benton's eyes widened. Wait, this was part of an audit. Simone looked at him unflinching. No, this was part of a truth check. Alvarez blinked. Ms. Carter, we weren't informed of any evaluation. You weren't supposed to be. Simone sat straighter. That's how we determine what's real. How people behave when they think they're looking at someone who has no power. You passed that test exactly the way I feared you would. The room shifted. Alvarez leaned back slightly. Hayes looked like someone had pulled the rug out from under his title. Simone pulled up her phone. She opened a secure app, tapped her ID, and a document loaded with a live watermark at Vivest Holdings. Audit, 17F compliance, and bias indicators. Grand Crest Airlines. The title alone was enough. Shaw's shoulders sank. He was no longer a silent observer. He was suddenly part of the report. There's no need to get legal involved just yet. Hayes began, his tone softening. Let's find a resolution that this room isn't about resolution, Simone interrupted. It's about perception management. You're not here to apologize. You're here to check whether I'm someone who can make noise loud enough to go public. No one spoke. She leaned forward, voice still calm. You want a resolution? Here it is. I'm rescinding my approval for the funding release tied to your operations renewal. The $4 billion proposal will be tabled indefinitely. Hayes paled. That funding is... Was she corrected? The weight of her words dropped like concrete into the center of the table. This wasn't about whether you said the wrong words, she continued. It's about a culture that allowed silence to do the dirty work. The culture that made it feel acceptable for a gate agent to question my presence. For a flight attendant to look through me. For this room to be built without a single apology built into its design. The air conditioning kicked on loud and hollow. Simone stood slowly, her chair barely making a sound against the floor. There are no cameras in here, she said, but there were plenty elsewhere. You don't need footage to prove intent. You only need to listen to the quiet choices people make when they think no one important is watching. Hayes opened his mouth again, but Simone held up a finger. I didn't ask to be treated like royalty. I didn't expect a red carpet. I didn't need a seat with extra legroom. I needed to be seen. That's all. And you failed. She gathered her documents. You'll receive the formal audit summary within 48 hours, along with a recommendation for structural overhaul if you intend to apply for federal partnership again. Alvarez looked like she wanted to say something, maybe even apologize. But by now, the moment for words had passed. This wasn't about performance, it was about truth. And truth doesn't come with scripts. As Simone walked toward the door, she paused. You're not the only airline under review, she said, without turning around. But after today, you've made yourselves unforgettable. Then she left. Not with anger, not with vengeance, with clarity. And in the room behind her, 3 people sat staring at empty chairs, realizing that the real audit hadn't just been of their airline. It had been of their humanity, Simone Carter's name didn't carry fame like a Hollywood star or trend across hashtags. Her face didn't show up in magazines or on glossy covers of Forbes. But where it mattered, in the rooms where billion-dollar decisions were made in the corridors lined with frosted glass and soundproof walls, her name didn't just carry weight. It defined futures. The irony was painful. For all the effort Grand Crest Airlines had spent building image reputation and brand polish, they had failed to notice the most important detail of all the signature beneath their salvation. Weeks before the incident at Logan International Airport, the board of the Strategic Aviation Resilience Trust had sat in a private chamber debating which carriers deserved to remain eligible for emergency infrastructure backing. Airlines across the country were struggling post-pandemic tremors, rising costs, labor strikes, and a $4 billion support fund had been carved from federal reserves to stabilize operations. Eligibility required one last sign-off, a discretionary review by the Trust's internal audit arm, a group known for its secrecy depth and scrutiny. Simone Carter had led that review. She had pored through internal ethics manuals, customer satisfaction reports, discrimination claims, and behavioral complaint patterns. Grand Crest was on thin ice, but they had one thing going for them: the opportunity to be better. To prove in real time that progress wasn't just lip service, she had designed the field audit to be quiet, immersive, unscheduled, a final litmus test of culture. And they failed it. But what stung most wasn't their failure. It was how casually they dismissed her humanity, how easily they had overlooked a woman, not because she was invisible, but because they chose to look past her. Back in her office in Washington, D.C., Simone sat at her desk late into the night. The room was quiet high above the streets, where sirens blurred into city hum. Her assistant had left hours ago, and only the faint glow of her desk lamp lit the room. Before her was a single printed form, a merger clearance document with Grand Crest's name at the top. Her initials were kneaded at the bottom. She stared at it for a long time. Her pen hovered. Then slowly, she wrote a single line beneath the official recommendation field: rescinded due to breach of ethical conduct, protocol bias, and failed audit response. She signed her name and dated it. That signature, that single pen stroke, held more power than any statement she could have made in that interrogation room. It carried the full authority of her role, the collective voice of everyone who had ever been turned away, dismissed, or humiliated because they didn't look like they belonged. It wasn't revenge, it was responsibility. 3 days later, the document reached Grand Crest's executive board. The announcement was immediate. Shares dropped 17% in a single afternoon. The proposed expansion of their transatlantic routes was put on indefinite hold. Press inquiries flooded their inboxes, and quietly behind closed doors, resignation letters were drafted. Yet publicly, they issued a sterile 2-line press release about unexpected funding complications. They never mentioned Simone's name. They never mentioned the woman they had tried to escort to the back of a plane. But others noticed. A handful of junior staffers within the airline, those who had seen what happened, who had felt the unease but stayed silent, began to speak. Whispered stories reached media outlets, leaked footage. Still shots of Simone in the lounge, the boarding gate, the security office. Slowly, a mosaic of truth began to emerge. And with it, questions they couldn't run from. Why wasn't she treated like every other passenger? Why was she assumed to be in the wrong place? Why didn't anyone pause long enough to ask who she was? rather than assume who she wasn't. Simone didn't go on camera. She refused interviews. She turned down feature requests and even an exclusive segment offer from a prime-time investigative show. But she did one thing. She published a public letter. One page, clean minimal. No accusations, no demands. Just a reflection. It read, "In part power is not always loud. Sometimes it sits quietly in coach class and economy lines, in boardrooms behind one-way glass. And sometimes it walks into a space dressed in a gray sweater and is told to turn around. But power doesn't vanish when it's ignored. It just learns exactly where to point the light when it's time to tell the truth." The letter went viral, not because of outrage, but because of resonance. Messages poured in, not just from women, not just from Black professionals, but from anyone who had ever felt that slight shift in tone, that subtle push out of place, that invisible barrier that says you don't belong. Some saw Simone as a symbol, others saw her as a mirror. But for her, it wasn't about either. It was about accountability. Because a system can only change when someone stops asking for permission to belong and starts making decisions based on the truth of what they see. The signature they ignored had become the one they could no longer escape. And the woman they dismissed quietly rewrote their future, not with rage, not with noise, but with something far more powerful: clarity. It wasn't the noise that changed things. It was the silence. The kind of silence that doesn't collapse under the weight of injustice, but gathers its breath, sharpens its focus, and waits for the moment it needs to speak with purpose. When Simone Carter stepped off that flight days earlier, she wasn't planning to dismantle an entire system. She had come to observe, to assess, to witness whether the ideals printed on every corporate value sheet actually showed up in the everyday moments, the interactions, the assumptions, the split-second decisions made without second thought. But what she saw wasn't just a lack of training. It was a deficit of humanity. Still, she hadn't reacted the way they expected her to. No confrontation, no raised voice. Her power didn't come from outrage. It came from restraint, from knowing that the story unfolding around her had already written its own ending. All she had to do was make sure someone read it, and someone did. The footage leaked by a junior operations tech who couldn't stomach the cover-up. The memo she never intended for the public, but was passed from inbox to inbox. The single-page audit result shared anonymously on a whistleblower site. None of it had Simone's fingerprints on it directly, and yet her presence was unmistakable in every line. Not because she was loud, but because she was undeniable. In the weeks that followed, Grand Crest's senior leadership faced inquiry hearings. An internal ethics overhaul began this time, not as a public performance, but as a requirement for survival. Simone never returned to the airline. She never needed to. Her impact lingered in empty executive chairs, revised protocol manuals, and in the eyes of every boarding agent trained to rethink what authority looks like. But more than that, something else began to ripple outward. Other companies, consultancies, finance groups, tech firms began reevaluating their own customer and internal experiences, not because they feared being punished, but because for the first time in a long time they feared being exposed by someone who wouldn't shout, wouldn't accuse, wouldn't fight, just witness. Quietly, precisely, with the full weight of their dignity intact. Simone didn't want recognition. She didn't seek headlines. What she carried was heavier than applause. It was the memory of how many people before her had been told to sit down to wait to move to the back, and how often they complied, not out of agreement, but out of exhaustion. She carried their stories with her like armor, invisible but never forgotten. Because sometimes silence isn't surrender. Sometimes it's strategy. Sometimes it's the calm before the decision that no one can undo. And for Simone, Carter's silence had never been weakness. It had always been her sharpest tool. The moment she chose to wield it, a multi-billion-dollar empire stumbled not because she screamed, but because she didn't have to. She simply refused to be erased. And in doing so, she became a voice far louder than anyone expected. In the heart of every system, be it a business, an institution, or a simple airport terminal, there are moments where the truth about who we are and what we stand for quietly reveals itself. Sometimes it doesn't arrive with a headline or a protest sign. Sometimes it arrives with a quiet woman in a gray sweater, standing in line, like everyone else, armed only with a plane ticket, calm eyes, and the decision not to let herself be unseen. Simone Carter didn't step into that first-class boarding line to prove anything. She didn't walk into that airport to make a statement. What she wanted was simple to see if the culture she'd been entrusted to evaluate still lived up to its values. What she received instead was the same treatment too many people experience every day: dismissal, suspicion, and judgment based solely on appearance. But Simone's story didn't unfold the way the staff at Grand Crest Airlines expected. They assumed she'd be just another face to shuffle along. What they didn't realize was that she was the one person in the room who understood the weight of silence and how to use it. Through a quiet refusal to be pushed aside, she reminded everyone what true power looks like. It's not always loud. It's not always reactive. Sometimes it's deliberate. Sometimes it's the strength to wait to endure, to let others speak long enough to reveal their own reflection. Simone never raised her voice, but she raised the stakes. And in the end, the company didn't just lose funding. It lost the illusion that its values could be printed but not practiced. This story isn't just about one woman. It's about what happens when we forget to look beyond the surface. When we let stereotypes make decisions before facts do. When we allow silence to be mistaken for insignificance. Simone's silence wasn't weakness. It was measured strength. It was the restraint of someone who could speak volumes but chose instead to listen, to document, to act with precision. And the result? A $4 billion decision that reminded an entire industry appearances don't determine impact. Behavior does. So what can we learn from Simone's journey? First, never underestimate the quiet ones. Those who walk gently often carry the sharpest truths. Second, check the lens through which you judge others. Are you seeing people clearly or only through the filters of bias, assumption, and fear? And third, if you hold power, any kind of power, use it to elevate those who've been ignored. Don't just defend diversity when it's convenient. Protect it when it's uncomfortable. That's where change begins. And for those who've ever felt dismissed, overlooked, or wrongly judged, let Simone's story remind you, you don't need to shout to be heard. Sometimes your dignity speaks loudest in how you choose to respond. You're allowed to walk away with your head high. You're allowed to write your own ending, just like she did. If this story moved you, if it made you reflect, or if it reminded you of your own strength, share it. Talk about it. And most importantly, subscribe to this channel. Because stories like Simone's matter. And we're here to keep telling them for the ones who didn't speak, the ones who couldn't speak, and the ones who are just now finding their voice. Subscribe so we can keep shining a light on truth, justice, and the kind of courage that doesn't need to raise its voice to be unforgettable.